I didn't plan on breaking down, on the road or in life, but sometimes, it feels like everything conspires to remind you how stuck you really are. The car sputtered, jolted, and then gave up completely, just like my marriage had. I pulled over to the side of that endless, empty road, the kind of road that stretches out in front of you like your regrets, with no clear destination and no sign of help. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, not out of anger, but because I didn't trust them not to shake. And as I sat there, staring at the dashboard, I couldn't tell if it was my car or my life falling apart, probably both. It's funny, really. You think you've built something strong, something unshakable, and then one little thing, a sputter, a silence, a stop, makes you realize just how fragile everything has been all along. There was no signal on my phone, no sound except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, and no one to call, not even Marcus. Not because he wouldn't answer, but because deep down, I didn't want him to. What was he going to say? What could he do? The truth was, I didn't need a fix for my car, I needed one for my life. And as I stepped out into the cool air, I had no idea that everything was about to change. Not in the way I wanted, but in the way I never saw coming. The sound of an approaching engine broke through the stillness, growing louder with every second until a sleek motorcycle came into view. I squinted against the sun, watching as the rider slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of me. He cut the engine, and for a moment, the silence returned, save for the faint sound of his boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped off. He removed his helmet, shaking out a mop of tousled dark hair that caught the light just enough to make me notice. His face was strong, sharp, the kind you don't forget, with a playful smile that tugged at the corner of his lips as he approached. He couldn't have been more than his late 20s. Rugged, confident, and with an air of ease that seemed out of place on this empty stretch of road. "You look like you could use some help," he said, his voice smooth and steady, with just enough humor to cut through my frustration. For a second, I hesitated. My instinct was to wave him off, to say I was fine, even though I clearly wasn't. But something about the way he looked at me, calm, assured, like he knew exactly what he was doing, made me stop. I exhaled and nodded. "Yeah, my car just quit on me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, stepping closer. "Mind if I take a look?" I moved aside as he leaned over the open hood, his movements precise, confident, like he'd done this 100 times before. The faint scent of leather and motor oil lingered in the air, and I found myself watching him more than I should have. His hands moved deftly, the muscles in his arms shifting under the snug fit of his jacket. "You've got a busted connector," he said after a few minutes, glancing up at me with a faint smile. "It's not too serious. I can patch it up enough to get you back on the road, but you'll need a proper repair soon." I nodded, grateful but also suddenly aware of how my heart was racing, not from panic, but from something else. "Thank you," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "No problem," he replied, his eyes meeting mine for a beat longer than necessary. As he worked, I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just his confidence or his skill, it was the way he made me feel, seen. Not like someone's wife, someone's burden, or someone's obligation. Just me. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag and straightened up, extending a hand toward me. "I'm Leo," he said, his smile easy but with a hint of something deeper. "Sienna," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was warm, firm, lingering just long enough to make my pulse quicken. "Well, Sienna," he said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a business card. "If you bring it to my shop, I'll make sure it's running like new." I took the card, my fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. "Thank you, Leo. Really. I don't know what I would have done without you." He flashed me another smile, this one softer, almost intimate. "Just glad I was passing by." With that, he climbed back onto his bike, the roar of the engine breaking the quiet once more. I watched as he disappeared down the road, leaving me standing there with a patched-up car, a racing heart, and a card in my hand that I couldn't seem to put down. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me shift, a spark I thought had long burned out. And as I climbed back into my car, the card still in my hand, I couldn't help but wonder what it was about Leo that made me feel so alive. As I drove away, the car humming back to life under Leo's skilled hands, I couldn't shake the strange feeling lingering in the pit of my stomach. His business card rested on the passenger seat, its clean, sharp lettering catching the last of the fading sunlight. My mind raced as I replayed every moment, the way his hands moved with such purpose, the warmth in his hazel eyes when he smiled, the way he said my name, like it wasn't just a name but something he wanted to remember. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "It's nothing," I muttered under my breath. "Just a kind stranger helping out." But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. It was the first time in years I'd felt, noticed. Not like Marcus saw me, as an extension of the life we'd built together, but as a person. A woman. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the cozy glow of the porch light already on, my thoughts were a tangled mess. Marcus was waiting by the door, his silver hair catching the soft light as he smiled at me. "There you are," he called, walking toward me. "I was starting to wonder if you got lost." I forced a smile, pushing the card deeper into my purse before stepping out of the car. "The car broke down," I said casually. "Someone stopped to help me fix it." His brow furrowed slightly. "Broke down? Everything okay now?" "Yes," I replied quickly, brushing past him and into the house. "He said it needs a proper repair soon, but it's fine for now." Marcus followed me to the kitchen, his voice carrying the same calm predictability it always did. "We should take it in tomorrow. Don't want it giving you trouble again." I nodded, setting my purse on the counter and reaching for a glass of water. He patted my shoulder gently, then turned toward the stove, stirring whatever he had simmering for dinner. His steadiness should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a heavy weight. As we ate, Marcus filled the silence with updates about his day, his voice steady and methodical. I nodded and smiled where appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere, back on that desolate road, with Leo's voice in my ears and his eyes locked on mine. "Anything interesting happen today?" Marcus asked, scooping mashed potatoes onto his plate. I hesitated for just a moment too long before shrugging. "Not really, just the car thing." He nodded, satisfied with my answer, and returned to his meal. I envied how easily he could accept things, how effortlessly he moved through life without questioning the cracks forming beneath the surface. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, his soft snores filling the room, I stared at the ceiling, unable to quiet my thoughts. My mind replayed every detail of the encounter with Leo, the way his hands had brushed against mine, the faint scent of motor oil mixed with pine, the easy confidence in his voice. I turned my head to look at Marcus, his face peaceful in the moonlight, and guilt began to creep in. Why was I thinking about another man when I had a perfectly good husband lying right next to me? Marcus had always been steady, reliable, kind. Everything you're supposed to want in a partner. And yet, there was something missing. Something I couldn't name but had felt for the first time in years when Leo looked at me. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, a spark I thought I'd lost. I closed my eyes, willing myself to stop the flood of thoughts, but the truth was inescapable. Leo had awakened something in me, something I wasn't sure I could ignore. And as I lay there, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen staring at Leo's business card, the bold lettering practically daring me to make a choice. The logical part of me said this was just about the car, a simple trip to the garage to avoid any future breakdowns. But deep down, I knew it was about more than that. It wasn't just the car I wanted fixed, it was me. I grabbed my keys and the card, tucking it into my purse before heading out. The drive to Leo's garage felt both exhilarating and unnerving. My heart raced with every mile, a mixture of anticipation and guilt swirling in my chest. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot, my palms were slick against the steering wheel. The garage was bustling with activity, mechanics darting between cars, tools clinking, and engines humming in the background. There was a vibrancy to the place, an energy that felt alive, in stark contrast to the stillness I'd grown used to at home. And then I saw him. Leo stood near the entrance, leaning casually against a lift, his t-shirt stretched just enough across his broad shoulders. He spotted me almost instantly, a smile spreading across his face as he walked over. "Well, look who decided to stop by," he said, his tone teasing but warm. "What brings you in today, Sienna?" I smiled back, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said the car needed a proper repair. Thought I'd take you up on that offer." His eyes lingered on mine for a moment before nodding. "Smart move. Let's take a look." As he guided my car into the garage, I couldn't help but take in the lively atmosphere around me. The mechanics joked and laughed as they worked, their movements fluid and purposeful. It was a world so different from my own, so full of life. Leo opened the hood and got to work, his hands moving with the same confident precision I'd seen before. "You know," he said after a moment, glancing up at me, "not many people would drive all the way out here just for a quick fix. Guess I must have made an impression." I laughed lightly, hoping it didn't sound as nervous as I felt. "Well, you were pretty convincing." He smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. "So, what do you do, Sienna? Besides driving cars that give you trouble?" His question caught me off guard, but something about the way he asked made me want to answer honestly. "Not much these days," I admitted. "I left my job a few years ago. Marcus is my husband, he wanted me to take it easy, focus on the house and other things." Leo nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And how's that working out for you?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It's fine," I said finally, though even I didn't believe it. He tilted his head, studying me. "Fine doesn't sound like much fun." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been, and I realized he was right. My life had become fine, steady, predictable, safe. But when was the last time it had been anything more? "I guess I've just been comfortable," I said, the word tasting bitter as it left my mouth. Leo set down his tools and leaned against the car, crossing his arms as he looked at me. "Comfort's overrated," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes, you've gotta shake things up to feel alive again." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Was he talking about the car? Or was there a message buried beneath those words, one meant just for me? The conversation shifted as he went back to work, asking me questions about my hobbies, my past, my dreams. I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years, sharing pieces of myself that even Marcus didn't know. And Leo listened, not distracted or dismissive, but fully present, like every word mattered. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the garage. "All done," he said, stepping back and wiping his hands. "She's good as new." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, not just for fixing the car, but for making me feel seen. He handed me the keys, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. "Anytime," he said, his voice lower now, more intimate. As I climbed back into the driver's seat, my heart felt heavier than it had when I arrived. I glanced back at Leo one last time before pulling out of the lot, his figure growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But the connection I felt, the spark he'd reignited, it was still there, burning quietly inside me. And as I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd just taken the first step toward something I couldn't turn back from. As I pulled into Leo's garage the following morning to address a lingering sound in the car, I told myself this visit was about maintenance, nothing more. That was the excuse I repeated over and over, even as my stomach fluttered at the thought of seeing him again. When I stepped out of the car, Leo was already waiting, leaning casually against a toolbox. His smile was easy and familiar, but there was something in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even expectation, that made my pulse quicken. "Back so soon?" he asked, his voice carrying just a hint of teasing. "Starting to think you like this place." I laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Well, you did say to come back if anything felt off." "Smart move," he replied, his gaze holding mine a beat too long before he walked over to the car. I followed him as he opened the hood, his hands immediately diving into the engine with the same precision and confidence that had captivated me the first time. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, the way his muscles shifted under his shirt, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow as he leaned over the car. "You really know what you're doing," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Leo glanced up, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Comes with practice." "Well," I added, my voice softening just slightly, "it's impressive. Not everyone can do what you do." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as he looked at me. "Are we still talking about the car?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. His tone was playful, but the intensity in his eyes made my breath hitch. I smiled, trying to keep it light. "Maybe," I said with a shrug, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. Leo chuckled, shaking his head as he returned his focus to the engine, but I didn't miss the way his lips curved into a slightly bigger smile. As he worked, our conversation drifted into more personal territory. We talked about everything and nothing, his time spent fixing cars, the way he loved the smell of motor oil because it reminded him of his dad's old garage, my memories of road trips before life became so predictable. Every word felt like a small thread weaving us closer together, and every laugh we shared felt like a quiet rebellion against the boundaries we both knew were there. "You've got a good laugh," I said at one point, the compliment slipping out before I could second-guess it. Leo glanced over at me, his hands pausing for just a moment. "You think so?" I nodded, my smile widening. "It's genuine. Not everyone has that." For a moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, he grinned. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment." "It was," I said, my voice soft. The air between us felt charged, every word and glance adding to the tension that seemed to build with each passing second. I knew I should step back, draw a line before it blurred any further, but I couldn't. Not when he looked at me like that, not when I felt so alive. Leo finished his work and closed the hood, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "All set," he said, his voice steady, but there was something different in his tone now. "Thank you," I replied, taking a small step closer. "You've been really helpful." "Just doing my job," he said, though his gaze flicked to mine, lingering for just a moment too long. There it was again, that unspoken pull, that quiet understanding that we were both standing too close to a line neither of us should cross. And yet, neither of us moved. "I should get going," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Leo replied, but he didn't look away. As I climbed back into the car, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, the memory of his smile etched into my mind. Driving away, I told myself that nothing had happened, that it was just harmless conversation and a few shared laughs. But deep down, I knew better. The line had been drawn, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist stepping over it. And the thrill of that possibility was enough to keep me awake long after I got home. Leo wiped his hands clean, setting his tools aside as he gestured toward his small office in the corner of the garage. "Why don't we go over the details in there?" he suggested, his tone casual but his eyes giving away something deeper. I hesitated for just a moment, my heart skipping a beat before I nodded. "Sure," I said, following him inside. The office was small but tidy, with a faint scent of leather and motor oil lingering in the air. A desk sat against the wall, cluttered with papers, tools, and a coffee mug that looked like it had seen better days. The blinds were half drawn, casting soft, diffused light across the room, making the space feel even more intimate. Leo leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms as he picked up a clipboard with the repair details. So, he began, flipping through the paperwork. The alternator needed a complete replacement, and I also checked the belts and battery just to make sure everything's running smooth. Shouldn't give you any trouble for a long time now. I nodded, barely registering his words as my eyes wandered, not just around the room, but to him. The way his t-shirt clung to his shoulders, the way his forearms flexed when he moved, the way his voice carried a quiet confidence that made it impossible to focus on anything else. Everything makes sense so far, he asked, looking up at me with a small smile. I blinked, forcing myself back to reality. Yeah. It all sounds good, I said, stumbling over my words. He chuckled softly, his eyes lingering on mine. You sure? You seem a little distracted. The comment hit closer to home than I wanted to admit, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. Just a lot on my mind, I said quickly, hoping it would deflect the conversation. Leo's smile softened, and he set the clipboard down, his expression turning more serious. Anything you want to talk about? His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I considered brushing it off. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like he genuinely cared, like he wanted to know me, that made it impossible to lie. I guess I've just been feeling stuck, I admitted, my voice quieter now. Leo nodded, his tone more composed now. Thanks. I'll be there in a minute. Ryan glanced back at me, his grin widening slightly. Didn't realize we had VIP clients today, he said, his voice laced with good-natured teasing. I laughed nervously, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. I wouldn't call myself a VIP. Just a very unlucky driver with bad car karma. Well, I hope Leo's giving you the 5-star treatment, Ryan replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Leo shot him a look, a mix of annoyance and amusement. Don't you have a car to finish, Ryan? Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender, the grease-stained rag still hanging from his fingers. All right. Just making sure you're not hogging all the good clients. As he turned to leave, Ryan paused in the doorway, his grin softening into something more genuine. Nice to meet you. Sienna, I offered, returning his smile. Nice to meet you, Sienna, he said, giving me a slight nod before stepping out and closing the door behind him. The room felt different now, the charged energy from moments before replaced with a strange mix of awkwardness and relief. Leo let out a breath he seemed to have been holding, leaning back against the desk with his arms crossed. Sorry about that, he said, his tone lighter now. Ryan's got a knack for walking in at the worst possible times. I chuckled, trying to mask how flustered I still felt. It's fine. He seems nice. Leo smirked, shaking his head. He's all right. Gets a little nosy sometimes, but he means well. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us shifting into something less intense but no less present. I could feel Leo's eyes on me, studying me in a way that made my heart race all over again. So, I said, breaking the quiet, you were saying something about being careful? Leo let out a dry laugh, his gaze dropping to the floor. Yeah. About that, before he could finish, I held up a hand, stopping him. It's okay. I get it. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine, and I could see the conflict written all over his face. Do you? He asked quietly, almost like he didn't believe me. I nodded, forcing a small smile. I do. And for what it's worth, I'm not sure what I'm doing either. His expression softened, and for a brief second, I thought he might close the distance between us again. But instead, he straightened, his hands sliding into his pockets. Well, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place, if you ever figure it out, let me know. I laughed softly, more to ease the tension than anything else. I'll keep that in mind. As I turned to leave, my hand hovering over the doorknob, I felt a strange pull to stay. To say something, anything, that might keep this moment alive a little longer. But instead, I took a deep breath and opened the door. Ryan was working on another car nearby, glancing up as I stepped out. "Take care, Sienna," he called, his tone warm and friendly. "You too," I replied, flashing him a quick smile before walking back to my car. The drive home was quiet, my thoughts swirling as I replayed everything that had just happened. The way Leo had looked at me, the way I'd felt so alive, so seen in his presence. And yet, the interruption had reminded me of the reality I couldn't escape, the line we were towing, the risks we were taking, and the life I had waiting for me at home. As I pulled into my driveway, Marcus was sitting on the porch, a book in his hands. He looked up and smiled as I parked, his expression calm and familiar, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I smiled back, but it felt hollow. The spark I'd felt with Leo was already beginning to fade, replaced by the weight of guilt and confusion. And as I stepped inside, I couldn't help but wonder how long I could keep balancing on this edge before I finally fell. Leo cleared his throat, pushing himself off the edge of the desk. "You know," he said, his voice lighter now, "why don't I show you around the shop? Might give you a better idea of what we do here." I hesitated for a moment, the tension from earlier still clinging to the air between us, but then I nodded. "Sure, why not?" As we stepped out of the office, Ryan was leaning against the hood of a car, wiping his hands with a rag. He looked up, his expression curious but friendly. "Giving the grand tour?" Ryan asked, raising an eyebrow. Leo smirked. "Figured it couldn't hurt to show her the ropes." Ryan grinned, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "Well, I'll tag along. Don't want you stealing all the credit." Leo rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of amusement in his expression. "Fine, but try not to scare her off." Ryan chuckled, falling into step beside us as Leo led the way through the bustling garage. The sound of tools clinking and engines humming created a steady background rhythm, and I found myself relaxing just a little in the lively atmosphere. "This here's the heart of the operation," Leo said, gesturing to the row of lifts where cars of all makes and models were being worked on. "We do everything from basic tune-ups to full restorations. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." "It's impressive," I said, meaning it. "There's so much energy here. It's alive." Ryan shot me a quick grin. "That's one way to put it. Keeps us on our toes, that's for sure." As we moved through the shop, Leo explained the different stations, pointing out where specific tasks like engine work or body repairs were done. Ryan chimed in occasionally with a joke or a story, his easy humor making the tour feel less formal and more like a shared moment between friends. But no matter how much I laughed at Ryan's quips or admired the craftsmanship on display, my attention kept drifting back to Leo. The way he spoke with quiet authority, the way his presence seemed to command the space without effort. Every now and then, his eyes would meet mine, and the weight of those glances made my breath catch every time. As we rounded the corner, Leo stopped in front of a restored classic car, the glossy paint gleaming under the shop lights. "This one's my favorite," he said, his voice softer now. "Spent months bringing it back to life." I stepped closer, running my fingers along the smooth surface. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Leo smiled, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. It was something deeper, more personal. It was a wreck when it came in. Everyone said it wasn't worth the effort, but I couldn't let it go. Something about it felt special. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, and I felt my chest tighten. Was he still talking about the car? Or was there something else he was trying to say? Ryan, sensing the shift in tone, clapped his hands together, breaking the moment. "All right, enough of the mushy stuff. Let's keep moving before Leo gets all sentimental on us." Leo shot him a look, but there was no malice in it. "You're lucky you're good with a wrench, Ryan." We all laughed, the tension easing slightly as we continued the tour. But even as Ryan kept the conversation light with his jokes and stories, the undercurrent between Leo and me remained, unspoken but undeniable. When we finally circled back to the office, Ryan gave me a quick nod. Well, it was nice meeting you, Sienna. Don't let Leo talk you into too many extra repairs, alright? I smiled, grateful for his humor. I'll keep that in mind. As Ryan walked off, leaving us alone again, the energy in the room shifted once more. Leo leaned against the desk, crossing his arms as he looked at me. So, he said, his tone casual but his eyes anything but, what did you think of the tour? It was insightful, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine. Glad to hear it. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything we weren't saying. My mind raced, torn between the life I'd built with Marcus and the spark I couldn't ignore with Leo. The logical part of me screamed to walk away, to end this before it went any further. But another part, the part that longed to feel alive again, urged me to stay. I should probably get going, I said finally, though I made no move to leave. Leo didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression a mix of hesitation and something deeper. Sienna, he began, his voice low and uncertain. I held my breath, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might make sense of the storm swirling inside me. But instead, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out what I wanted. And in that moment, I wasn't sure I knew the answer. All I knew was that the line between us was growing thinner with every passing second, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist crossing it. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, my feet feeling like they were rooted to the ground, my mind a mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. But then, I forced myself to step back, to create the space I knew I needed. Thank you, Leo, I said softly, my voice steadier than I felt. And thank Ryan too, for everything. Leo's expression flickered with something I couldn't quite place. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning to mine. Anytime, Sienna. Drive safe, all right? I gave him a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. I will. As I turned and walked out of the office, I felt the weight of his eyes on my back, the silence between us louder than anything that had been said. Ryan was working on another car nearby and looked up as I passed. Take care, Sienna, he called, his grin easy and genuine. You too, I replied, managing a quick wave before slipping into my car. The engine roared to life, steady and reliable, but the same couldn't be said for my thoughts. As I pulled out of the lot and onto the open road, the guilt began to settle in, heavy and unrelenting. What was I doing? What had I almost done? The drive home was quiet, save for the hum of the car and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if holding on to it could somehow anchor me in the storm of my emotions. I replayed every moment in my mind, the way Leo had looked at me, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way I felt when he was near. It was intoxicating, magnetic, and utterly wrong. And yet, it wasn't just about Leo. It was about what he represented, a spark, a connection, a reminder of what it felt like to be alive. For years, I had convinced myself that comfort and stability were enough, that the life Marcus and I had built was all I needed. But now I wasn't so sure. As I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow across the front of the house. Marcus was sitting on the porch swing, his book resting on his lap as he looked up and smiled at me. It was the kind of smile that once made me feel safe, loved. Now, it felt like a mirror, reflecting the guilt I carried inside. Hey, you're back, he said, standing up and walking toward the car. I stepped out, forcing a smile as I met his gaze. Yeah, everything's fixed. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I whispered into the quiet room, more to myself than to him. Is this enough? Can we find it again? Marcus didn't stir, and I wasn't sure I wanted him to. For now, the questions would stay unanswered, lingering in the silence like the echoes of choices I hadn't yet made.